So with that, we will go ahead and get started and give Cody the floor.
All right, well, thank you. And true to academic form here, the title is slightly adjusted as it goes, right? If you let me see if I can get this playing here. All right, can everybody see? Good. Okay. Well, good morning. Thanks to all who organized this workshop, particularly to Karen and Emily for actually working more around my schedule, but also working around my toddler's schedule. And also thanks to Paul for joining us today, and to all of you. It's good to see you. I'm here today to talk about the International War Crimes Tribunal that took place as two different sessions in 1967, and that tried the United States for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in Vietnam. Of course, the first question we have to ask ourselves as historians is, who cares? I mean, this is, after all, a tribunal of largely white men, including one white woman, one female lawyer, and two black men, criticized at the time for being a kangaroo court, a joke, and a piece of communist propaganda. And who could really disagree? Most jurors were of international origin, were highly critical of the US, and had leftist political beliefs, if not outright members of some local communist parties. The historiography has largely defended this perspective without even attempting to analyze, contextualize, or make significant the contributions of the IWCT on the global anti-war movement, the human rights movement, or even the broader anti-imperialist movement. And while decrying American centrism and exceptionalism themselves, scholars have upheld the historical journalistic opinions of the tribunal as being too biased, as being too one-sided in its criticism, as being too anti-American. And indeed, while the literature is critical of American war crimes as a concept, it remains uneasy analyzing the study of a tribunal that was critical of Americans without criticizing the other side too. This is not to say that historians haven't studied anti-war organizations at the international level, nor have historians strayed from studying war crimes in Vietnam. Martin Klemke, Jeremy Varon, Judy Wu, even Nick Terse have put together really marvelous studies that focus on international anti-war groups who organize their resistance in part based on their moral revulsion to America's actions in Vietnam. Yet moral outrage from the IWCT is not enough because, as one scholar has written, even though anti-war activists considered the war immoral, the, quote, Vietnam War did not serve as an incubator of human rights ideas. So while my dissertation spends more time analyzing how the tribunal encouraged rhetorical shifts and attempted to shape the discourse using the anti-war movement, today I want to focus on the origins and the aims of the tribunal to argue that the IWCT was not a piece of communist propaganda, and that its role went far beyond simply criticizing American war crimes, that it instead served as an incubator of ideas that tried to tip opinion against the war and mobilize anti-war activists with evidence from the war in real time. I do this by situating the history of the tribunal amidst a literature composed of Cold War peace studies, those that examine the anti-war movements during the Vietnam War, human rights history, and studies that analyze the people's tribunals. So to do this, I'm going to walk you through three major claims that will hopefully provide greater clarity to our understanding of the IWCT's importance, not just as pieces of communist propaganda, but a decades-long, well-thought-out organization of public peace activism designed to mobilize public opinion. And first, I'll consider the weakness of the post-war international community, at least as Bertrand Russell saw it. I'll discuss Russell's view of experts and expertise as essential to informing a well-equipped resistance movement, and I'll turn to Russell's desire to mobilize public opinion against the war. And I'll describe how his establishment of the IWCT as a people's tribunal attempted to connect the anti-war movement with real-time evidence about US war crimes in Vietnam. The Cold War's end presented United Nations members with a challenge not seen since the end of World War II, which was create and maintain the conditions for a peaceful world. And from its founding in 1945 to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991, the UN witnessed an increasingly armed nuclear world, atrocious conflicts between superpowers on the periphery, and all too frequent human rights violations committed by those who had once agreed to never again allow for the abuse of civilians by all too powerful perpetrators. Along the way, it had seen its peacemaking mandate limited and its oversight of the democratic process hampered by ideologically opposed foes. It made all the more sense that in 1992, the UN released a document titled Agenda for Peace, stating that, quote, it must never again be crippled as it was in the era that has now passed. Here was the dream of a new founding moment, writes historian Mark Mazauer, as if the world had turned back the clock to the hopes of 1945. Had esteemed philosopher and celebrated pacifist Bertrand Russell lived until 1992, 22 years after his death, he already lived to like 91 or something, right? He likely would have agreed that the UN's founding charter had been crippled by its member nations, and that decades immediately following the 1940s revealed the irreparable weakness of the intergovernmental organization itself. Russell spent the latter half of the 1940s and all of the 1950s fighting for a world government that would never come into existence, an entity fully capable of reducing armed conflict, preventing or at least limiting the proliferation of nuclear weapons worldwide, and willing to uphold international law through the creation of an international criminal court. To Russell, the Soviet Union, and even more the United States, pursuit of separate interests created unnecessary tension as each competed for geopolitical and economic security, backed by an expansive nuclear arsenal. The conflicts that arose in the Cold War's peripheral countries resulted in these massive killing fields. I think I should wink at Paul when I say that, right? With each superpower intervention, conflicts that brought with it the additional uncertainty of nuclear annihilation. Although Russell would continue to believe that the world needed a regulatory authority stronger than the UN, he started turning more toward the non-state in the belief that the opposite of the state was not anarchy, but organized and informed resistance from below. The publication and distribution of unbiased, factual, and transparent information curated by knowledgeable professionals were directly responsible for bypassing what he called a government-controlled media. Does that sound familiar? That seemed to cower before the official positions by their government and taking the evidence to activists who in turn could weaponize verifiable facts to lead massive protests against immoral and illegal government systems. Now, for this reason, the primacy of the non-state power guided Russell's anti-nuclear activism in the 1950s, and it allowed him to evolve as a global organizer of peace leading up to the Vietnam War. Russell served as a self-designated citizen diplomat in the early Cold War when he engaged with second-track diplomacy to help de-escalate and resolve international conflicts between the US and the Soviet Union that brought the world to a nuclear brink on more than one occasion. Having gained an international following of academics and activists who looked to him for guidance on the anti-nuclear movement, he perhaps felt empowered to take his opinions about world affairs directly to world leaders with whom he disagreed as an act of diplomatic intervention and as a self-appointed, what he called a representative of humanity. Now, moving beyond these acts of individual people's diplomacy, though, Russell looked at the larger collective of anti-nuclear activists and saw the potential for a movement of non-state actors forcing world leaders to bend to their demands. In July 1957, Russell, Joseph Rotblat, and other founders of Pugwash, a coalition of scientists who protested nuclear weapons by sharing information about the inhumane and harmful effects of nuclear fallout, they rallied together and prioritized knowledge as a common good that they thought deserved to be unbiased, objective, and accessible. They asked questions that checked the veracity of the government's official reports, which often downplayed the negative consequences of nuclear testing. Russell then used this evidence and expertise to mobilize public opinion against nuclear weapons during the 1950s, and again in opposition to the Vietnam War during the 1960s. The creation of, say, the Committee for Nuclear Disarmament, the Direct Action Campaign, the Committee of 100, and others relied on a broad coalition of non-state actors and information networks that together told the truth about war, the perpetrators, nuclear weapons, the tools used to inflict violence upon civilians over time. Now, the escalation of US bombing of North Vietnam in March 1965 under the codename Operation Rolling Thunder led Russell and his colleagues to denounce the Johnson administration's illegal use of air power for the indiscriminate destruction of villages and infrastructure. Quote, it requires not only the fiendish ingenuity, but a vast industry to create and refine instruments of war to maim and terrify people, napalm, which sticks more firmly to the human skin, or canisters of steel pellets, which enter and circulate the bodies of their victims, Russell would later recall in the IWCT's report. The US harnessed the power of its technological predominance and relied upon its highly trained armed forces and forcefully relocated South Vietnamese civilians to prevent the expansion of communism in the third world. Russell again says, quote, these crimes are on our conscience. And for my part, I will not rest until those responsible for them are removed from public life. This is what he said in October 1965 as the war is really taking off. And he starts to work tirelessly behind the scenes to create a tribunal to publicize what he saw as war crimes against civilians. This brings me to the claim number 3 that I'm making here. The formation of what would eventually be called the International War Crimes Tribunal, as I'm so calling it, the IWCT, or in contemporary media, the Russell Tribunal. It gathered steam after Russell's 1963 article in the New York Times that labeled the war a, quote, atrocity and institutionalized criticism against the Vietnam War as barbarous, as immoral, as a genocidal conflict. The history of Russell's post-1945 non-nuclear weapons and peace activism inspired him to create the tribunal after accepting the ineptitude of the international community and the United Nations to prevent global annihilation by atomic war, let alone stop one of the major superpowers from actually violating laws of war and human rights agreements. And he held them accountable before a world government, or at least had hoped to, or perhaps a future international criminal court. But recognizing the limitations of such a non-state court as the IWCT, Russell instead set out to design a tribunal that would be a bugle for peace in Vietnam, relying on a range of experts, fact-finding missions, and eyewitness accounts submitted by Vietnamese civilians to support the global anti-war movement with volumes of evidence exposing American war crimes. Like the creation of Pugwash before Vietnam, the IWCT weaponized information to mobilize an empathetic and morally driven peace movement against the Vietnam War and more broadly against American imperialism. The lack of a UN-supported international criminal court meant that crimes against humanity might go unpunished and that victims of such violence would never see justice. Russell's proposed tribunal would not have the same legal jurisdiction as the International Criminal Court. Instead, it would rely on spreading information through word of mouth to make the global public better aware of US actions in Vietnam. The philosopher reasoned that the tribunal could try and convict the Johnson administration for war crimes in Vietnam with the understanding that such a conviction did not carry the more formal legal backing of a criminal court. Instead, he hoped that their findings would support a global resistance movement to topple American hegemony. Russell described the United States as, quote, a universal empire of evil that could be stopped only by a coalition of, quote, American dissenters, liberals, and socialists in defense of the Vietnamese people. By collaborating with tribunal members from around the world and making bystanders aware of the victimization of the Vietnamese, he hoped that an international movement would soon confront the US government and other complicit governments around the world. So in 1966, the New York Times actually announced the creation of this tribunal, tasked by Russell to decide, to quote, decide whether the American conduct of the war in Vietnam constituted a crime against humanity. The resulting court commenced in early 1967 to weigh evidence and try the United States for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace in Vietnam. For several long days across 2 separate sessions, members including several high-profile philosophers, lawyers, scientists, former heads of state, and peace activists. And I will say that he was good friends with Jeremy Popkin's father too. Well, friends might be a liberal term, but he was in relations with him on a previous committee. Anyway, they listened to eyewitness testimonies from Vietnamese civilians who described unwarranted attacks on their villages by American air power. They listened to American soldiers who described in barbaric detail the use of torture against the Vietnamese suspected of working for the communists. And they presented to the world one of the first detailed looks at the impact of napalm, incendiary weapons, and for the first time, fragmentation bombs upon the human body, including the bodies of children, which you can see in the very blurred image on the right. In between testimonies, scientific and medical and military experts collaborated the victim stories by disclosing top secret information about collateral damage. IWCT members even traveled to Vietnam on a fact-finding mission to collect indisputable proof that the US military deliberately targeted Vietnamese infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, churches, and villages. So by the end of 1967, tribunal members convicted the US of violating human rights agreements, waging a genocidal war, and committing war crimes during the course of America's intervention in the Vietnam War. Now, unlike other truth projects, tribunals, and transitional justice groups that are born out of the end of a given conflict to assess the damage and help countries transition to a brighter, nonviolent future, the IWCT popped up during the war in an effort to analyze in real time claims that the US was committing war crimes and violating human rights in Vietnam. Like other transitional justice strategies, the US hoped to weigh evidence in ways that would concurrently raise awareness about how the war in Vietnam violated international law and human rights standards. And in the end, members anticipated that news about the tribunal's findings would help to expand the anti-war movement around the world, while also supplying them with evidence to support the movement itself. Focusing on what Russell called the means of warfare, to hone in on civilian casualties, Russell sent up red flags to the atrocities taking place in Vietnam under the supervision of the US military, and also committed by South Vietnamese and American bombers and ground troops. And there's no doubt that Hanoi resoundingly celebrated Russell's efforts and undoubtedly supplied the IWCT with propaganda, but that of which they could detail in verifiable attacks, verifiable fact-finding missions, and verifiable evidence that they brought before the tribunal. And journalists, too, independently reporting on the war, described the tactical use of napalm and fragmentation bombs as counterproductive terms that turned South Vietnamese people against the US and drove them into guerrilla groups. One journalist says, quote, "How can one expect the countryside not to rally to the insurgents in such circumstances?" Violent attacks against non-combatants included women and children, and those wounds and death counts reflected the blurred lines between war and society in Vietnam. Even without Russell's help, the horrors of the war on civilians appeared on America's televisions when, in August 1965, reporter Morley Safer appeared on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite from the village of Com Nay, where Marines were seen using their own Zippo lighters to ignite the thatched roof of family homes. The reporter Safer says, quote, "Today's operation is the frustration of Vietnam in miniature. There's little doubt that American firepower can win a military victory here. But to a Vietnamese peasant whose home means a lifetime of back-breaking labor, it'll take more than presidential promises to convince him that we are on his side." The lack of a UN-supported international criminal court meant that crimes against humanity might go unpunished, and that the victims of such violence would not see justice. Russell's proposed tribunal would not have that kind of legal jurisdiction that you would see elsewhere, per se, an international criminal court. So he's reasoning that the tribunal could actually try and convict the Johnson administration for war crimes in Vietnam with the understanding that such a conviction isn't going to give them that legal founding. But here's the big point. The IWCT is most striking when seen as a part of a larger democratic movement in response to the limitations of international legal frameworks and institutions. The Nuremberg trials had the authority of the international community to retroactively try Nazi war criminals for committing acts against humanity during World War II by using the force of a coalition of governments in the Western world, albeit the victors. The IWCT, in comparison, was an ambitious organization composed of non-state actors who created an international body politic to try and prevent human rights violations in real time. By crafting a new dialogue about human rights and war crimes, the tribunal handed over to the anti-war movement a new agenda, foremost motivated by human rights. In following the tradition of the Nuremberg trials, Russell and the IWCT actually changed the dialogue about the Vietnam War and the student movements and pointed them toward issues regarding human rights as a unifying factor that would bring together disparate movements around the world. And like Russell's preceding organizations prior to the Vietnam War, the tribunal was also designed as a hub of information to help activists and movements and organizations. Russell surmised that a successful tribunal could carry knowledge about the war to a mass audience, which could choose either to accept or deny it. If accepted, this knowledge could be shared among the communities around the world and could unite activists against the war. The tribunal's legitimacy thus rested not on international law as a form of justice, but on public acceptance and acknowledgement of its findings and verdict. The tribunal sessions would convey a sense of urgency to bring the war to a close so that further human rights violations against innocent civilians would not occur. And when asked by Guardian journalist Richard Gott in early 1966 whether or not Russell thought the IWCT would succeed, he responded, quote, "We are doing it in the face of universal hostility. It has to be organized. And the United States has to be tried for genocide. There is no other way." However, Russell's decades-long commitment to creating a more peaceful world, leading through the abolishment of nuclear weapons and subsequently the defense of human rights in Vietnam against US imperialist aggression, allowed him to channel his past activities into the contemporary anti-war movement that he saw taking place across the US and around the world. The UN suffered from impotence, Russell argued, and therefore the enforcement of peace fell to non-state actors who would rely on evidence from oppressed voices and firsthand accounts to inform a more knowledgeable and capable resistance movement. Pugwash taught him the value of the transnational flow of information by experts from both sides of the Iron Curtain as a means of demanding policy shifts from world leaders. The founding of the IWCT to publicize American war crimes and mobilize public opinion served as an extenuation of these ideas that he first learned in the 1950s. By the start of the Vietnam War, with reports that America committed war crimes against civilians using napalm and fragmentation bombs, Russell and his supporters were prepared to use this transnational information network and interconnected global protest groups to reawaken the world's conscience and to convince the masses to resist American imperialism wherever it next reared its head in the Cold War. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cody, for a really and truly interesting talk. I appreciate it. Next, we will turn to John Perry.
Thank you, Dr. Patroon, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. It's nice to see everyone. Let me just see if I can pull this up here. So my dissertation title too has gone through a lot of different changes, especially over the last couple of weeks. As it is now, it's power, statelessness, and contested sovereignty in the Middle East, the United States, Palestinian refugees, the Muslim Brotherhood, Syrian ethnic minorities, and the early Cold War. I'm going for the longest title that I can come up with right now. Today, I'm going to be going over my chapter on the Muslim Brotherhood. So the way my presentation will work is that I'm just going to sort of run you through my overall argument for my dissertation. Then I'll move into my chapter on the Muslim Brotherhood as a case study to sort of demonstrate my argument. So very basically, my argument runs something like this, that non-state actors of the Middle East ultimately are the ones who shape how the early Cold War unfolds in the Middle East. So the actors of my study, Palestinian refugees, the Muslim Brotherhood, Syria's Armenians and Kurds, I argue are going to be the ones who really sort of mold, transform, and sometimes dictate the policies, objectives, aims, alliances, and strategies of not just the superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union, but also the regional governments of the Middle East. So Egypt's government, Syria's government, Jordan's government, et cetera, et cetera. Now this is important because most of the historiography on this time period and region looks at state actors. It looks at how the state has really molded and crafted the Cold War and the history of the region. My dissertation really sort of challenges these state-centric frameworks and tries to point to the way local actors have really transformed and molded global developments. Furthermore, these actors are important because they really sort of demonstrate the limits of the post-colonial nation state. So these actors don't really fit into the nation states that come into being as we transition from empire to nation state. We find that empire itself often could accommodate difference much better than the nation state. Now that's not to say that empire didn't have violence and coercion, but the very nature of it necessitated some sort of system to incorporate difference because its nature was to conquer new peoples, incorporate them into the empire. Whereas the nation state has a tendency to homogenize those within its borders, as well as to sort of try to look for ways in which to exclude those outside of its borders. So the groups of my study really are sort of these minority nationalist groups that were part of this larger nationalist group. So for example, in Egypt, they had this nationalist movement to free themselves from the British Empire. Part of this nationalist movement were groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, but once they start to create their secular nation state, the Muslim Brotherhood finds itself not quite fitting in. And looking at these groups really sort of demonstrates some of the limits of post-colonialism, as well as some of the ways in which empire accommodated difference, perhaps better than the nation state. So like I mentioned, the group that I'm going to look at today is the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood initially was just a small organization that began in 1928 in Ismailia, Egypt. It was founded by Hassan al-Banna. Its purpose was at the beginning just to be a local club to voice public concerns, to look at social issues, to have communal fraternity, but very quickly it's going to rise in popularity and power. The Brotherhood is going to ultimately create a political platform that's based on anti-British, anti-Western, anti-colonialism. And its popularity is going to skyrocket in the 1930s. So by 1945, the Brotherhood is going to have a membership of roughly 500,000 members, and it's going to have millions of supporters and sympathizers. Furthermore, it will also develop branches in Jordan, Palestine, Syria, and these branches will have strong connections to the branch in Egypt, but they'll also be able to work independently of the main branch in Egypt. Now, to understand how the Brotherhood was able to rise so quickly, we have to understand British colonialism in Egypt and in the Middle East generally. So in 1882, the British are going to invade and occupy Egypt. They're going to remain there. In 1922, they're going to unilaterally declare Egyptian independence. But this is really just to create a puppet state, a puppet regime. London is still really running the show. They're going to remain there after World War II. After World War II, they're still going to have roughly 100,000 troops at the Suez Canal. But to understand how the Brotherhood is going to become so popular, we have to look at what the British and Western powers are doing more generally in the Middle East. So here we have a map of the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is going to be when the British and the French got together during World War I, and they looked to figure out ways, okay, how are we going to divvy up what remained of the Ottoman Empire? In the yellow here, we can see this is going to be what ends up being the British mandates. In the blue, that's going to be the French mandates. And ultimately, these mandates will lead to the borders of the nation states of Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And just as a quick sort of side note, we can see some of the processes that I was referencing with regards to the transition from empire to nation state with this map. Now, once these borders are drawn, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, these borders are going to cut right through the homelands of groups like the Armenians and the Kurds, where they're going to lose their homeland and then be divided up into these various nation states, and they're not going to quite fit in. We can still see this in the news today, where the Kurds are really still sort of fighting for their own homeland. And later on, the Palestinians are going to join these groups and really having their homeland carved up by these great powers. So again, the point is to understand how the Brotherhood is going to gain so much popularity is because of the political platform that is anti-colonial, anti-British, anti-Western generally, and this is going to give them tremendous power and popularity very quickly. So by 1945, like I mentioned, the British still have roughly 100,000 troops stationed at the Suez Canal. The primary issue facing the Egyptian populace at this time period is the renegotiation of the 1936 lease that allowed the British to station troops there. Most of the Egyptian populace, their primary concern is just getting rid of the British, getting their troops out. Now that World War II is over, they see no reason why they should still be stationed there. And leading these calls, leading the way, is the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood by this time period has tremendous power. They can instigate violent riots, demonstrations, marches, almost any time they choose. Anytime the government comes out with a policy that they don't like, they can flood the streets with their supporters and their members. Moreover, they routinely engage in bombings, shootings, and terrorist attacks. So this is really a regular occurrence for life in most of Egypt in this time period. We can see that they're going to really almost have as much power as the state itself. So they're going to wield tremendous influence over what the state can and can't do, and specifically what the state can and can't do with regards to its foreign policy. This is going to play a strong role on the United States in the Middle East. So the US is going to inherit this situation after World War II when they suddenly find that they have tremendous responsibility around the world, including the Middle East. The Middle East is going to be deemed one of the most strategically important regions in the world by US officials. They see the Middle East as playing a very important role in their Cold War strategy. For US officials, the potential to go to war with the Soviet Union in this time period is a very real potential. That sounds kind of strange to us, perhaps, but the idea of World War III was a real threat that they calculated for. And they deemed that if that happened, the Soviet Union would probably be able to take Europe without the US being able to do much about it. But the way they figured that they would counter that would be up through the Middle East and into the Soviet Union's soft underbelly. And Egypt fit very, very strongly within this strategy for the Middle East. Egypt had a leadership position, still has a leadership position within the Arab world. So it wielded tremendous influence amongst the other Arab countries. It contained the Suez Canal. So it had a lot of importance for US policymakers in their Cold War strategies. What the United States wants to do ultimately is to bring Egypt into a security apparatus for the Middle East like that of NATO. So they want Egypt to take the lead in creating a mechanism that would defend the region against the Soviet Union if the Soviets attempted to invade. But as we'll see, the Muslim Brotherhood is going to play a very strong role in preventing this from happening. Now, one of the things US officials see with regards to not just Egypt, but the Middle East generally, is that they see all the instability. So the riots, the demonstrations, as well as the attacks, the bombings, the shootings, they don't really see this for what it is, which is anti-colonial nationalism. They see this as Soviet meddling. They see this as Soviet agitation. They see this as the Soviet Union attempting to undermine Western policies in the hopes of supplanting Western influence with Soviet influence. So this is going to be a very important factor in understanding US policy in the Middle East, not just in Egypt, but for most of the region throughout this time period. So when we're looking at US-Egyptian relations, we can see that the Brotherhood is playing a very strong role in molding and transforming US-Egyptian relations. So anytime the US government starts to engage the Egyptian government, the Brotherhood instigates a march, or the Brotherhood instigates a riot, or they instigate a bombing. So it becomes very dangerous for the Egyptian government to have any kinds of relations with the United States, as well as the British. We're going to see that the US, the more and more this happens, the more bombings there are, the more riots there are, the more the United States government is going to tilt towards supporting the British troops in the region, in Egypt. Initially, US officials deemed Egyptian independence as the best way to stabilize Egypt and therefore to secure it from the Soviet Union. But the more instability there is, the more the United States is going to tilt towards supporting the British. They're even going to go so far as to publicly declare their support to the British, but this creates a bit of a paradox, whereby in seeking stability, the US officials create more instability, because the more the US works or attempts to work with the Egyptian government, the more the Brotherhood and groups like the Brotherhood instigate attacks and just further instability generally. Now, in 1948, the partition of Palestine is going to occur, and we're going to find that everything is going to get worse for all parties involved. We're going to see that shootings are going to increase, bombings are going to increase, marches, rallies, demonstrations, and this is because of the partition of Palestine. The United States is going to play an instrumental role in the UN decision to partition of Palestine. In 1948, millions of Palestinians are going to lose their homes. They're going to be forced to flee to neighboring countries. They're going to flood into these countries, and they're going to be forced to live in these really horrible makeshift camps. Many are going to have to live there for decades. Now, these camps are then going to put tremendous strain on the communities that house them. These communities that house them are then going to put tremendous strain on their national governments to do something about it. And the United States is going to be held as having the most responsibility for this crisis. So now we have a situation where the native populace is beginning to see the United States as simply just this new colonial power. Whether that's true or not is irrelevant for our discussion, but the native groups see the US as engaging in violent colonialism. They've supported the partition of Palestine. Now they've got millions of Palestinians who are homeless. There's numerous reports of human rights violations coming out of the area. Now it's becoming dangerous for any nation in the Middle East to have dealings with the United States, because if they do, they risk riots, demonstrations, or attacks occurring. So everything is going to become exponentially worse for US officials in this time period. What one US official says is that the situation goes from critical to catastrophic. So it was already horrible, but with the partition of Palestine, it becomes almost inconceivable that things can get better. In 1948 as well, Egyptian officials are going to discover something called the secret apparatus. So the secret apparatus is going to be a clandestine wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, whose sole purpose is to engage in bombings, shootings, terrorist attacks, and carrying out of these operations. So the Egyptian government at this point is going to outlaw the Muslim Brotherhood. This is going to have very little effect because the Brotherhood has so much popularity that it's still able to largely function. But the police very soon after are going to assassinate the Brotherhood's leader, Hassan al-Banna. This is going to force the Brotherhood to create an alliance with an old political party that had largely fallen out of favor in the 1930s. This party is called the WAFT, but the Brotherhood is going to create an alliance with the WAFT, where they agree to bring the WAFT back into power in the upcoming parliamentary elections. And in return, the WAFT is supposed to reinstate them. So the Brotherhood is easily able to bring them into power. They gain a huge majority in parliament, but the WAFT hesitates. They hesitate to bring the Brotherhood back into the public realm because they see that it presents obvious dangers to the state. This is going to lead the Brotherhood to seek out a new alliance. So they're going to seek out an alliance with a group of young officers in the army who are ultimately become the Free Officers. Here we have a picture of Nasser, who's eventually going to lead the Free Officers. But they develop this relationship with them because they want to be reinstated. They want to be reinstated, and they come to an agreement with the Free Officers that they'll help bring them to power, and in return they'll be reinstated, as well as some religious policies are to be implemented. The Brotherhood wants a religious state. So this new union is formed, and the Free Officers in July of 1952 implement a bloodless coup. And I argue that the Free Officers could not have done this without the support of the Brotherhood. I'd even go so far as to say the Free Officers couldn't have come to power, period, without the support of the Brotherhood. But once the Free Officers are in power, some problems are going to develop. So both the government and the Brotherhood are going to start to split. So the government is going to split into two different factions. One faction led by Nasser, the other is going to be led by the individual on the left here, Colonel Mohammed Naguib. So we have these two factions of the government. On the other hand, we have the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're going to split too. So by this time period, the secret apparatus is going to completely break away from the Brotherhood and is going to wage war on the entire government. So it's waging war. It doesn't care whether it's Naguib's faction or Nasser's faction. They're just waging total war. But the majority faction of the Brotherhood is going to align itself with Naguib, because in return for its support, Naguib promises to implement more religious policies, more of a religious state in return for the Brotherhood's support. So they're really working against Nasser to try to prevent him from gaining further power, because Nasser ultimately wants to implement a secular state. Now, I would argue at this point, although there's not a ton of evidence, that Nasser probably has a lot of support from the United States government in this time period. I'd argue that the US probably assisted them in the 1952 revolution. Nasser and the United States initially looked very favorably on each other. We often learn, you know, the sort of classic confrontations between the US and Nasser, but that really won't start until after the Suez Crisis in 1956. So between 52 and 56, Nasser and the United States government have a very strong relationship, and they really both look to the other as means to attain their ends. The US sees Nasser as the means to attaining stability in Egypt and as a way to bring them into a security apparatus. They won't have to support the British if they can rely on Nasser, and that will help stabilize the situation. Whereas Nasser sees the US as being able to help him quell the domestic issues. So ultimately, Nasser is going to win out in this struggle. In 1954, the Brotherhood is going to attempt to assassinate Nasser, and this will give him the excuse to liquidate the organization. From this point on, 1954 onwards, the organization has to function underground. Like as before, it's still able to function. It still maintains a very strong presence in the country, but it's going to remain publicly outlawed until the 1970s, when Nasser's successor, Anwar al-Sadat, comes to power and looks for ways to legitimize his own regime by reinstating the Muslim Brotherhood. But what we see happening here ultimately is the Muslim Brotherhood playing a very crucial role in transforming and influencing not just the policies of Egypt, but also of the United States. So in conclusion, we see that these local actors, this non-state group, the Muslim Brotherhood, is shaping global developments. We see them shaping the early Cold War. We see them transforming the way in which the Cold War plays out. Furthermore, we can see that they demonstrate some of the limits of post-colonial liberation, of the post-colonial state, because even though Egypt finally does free itself from Britain once Nasser comes to power, or at least begin to, they still don't quite fit into this new nation state. And we can still see this today, that it's still the Muslim Brotherhood and the army who are at odds for control of Egypt today. They're still the ones who are struggling against each other to figure out who's really going to run this nation state. What kind of nation state is this going to be? And we can see that there's some significant limits to the nation state and post-colonialism generally. And that's my story. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. Both of you have really done a great job of presenting this material, and I'm very glad to see that. Next, we will have our discussant, Professor Paul Chamberlain.
All right. Can everybody hear me? So thank you for having me here today, and thanks to John Perry and Cody Foster for their papers. Both of you are interested in kind of the role that non-state groups play in shaping structures of global power, right? That's one of the things that connects these two different stories across time and space. And so in that sense, I would sort of frame my comments around this big question, which has driven a lot of the scholarship in this area, which is, basically just, do non-state groups really matter? Or are states really the only meaningful players on the world stage, right? I think we have to begin by acknowledging that there is a power disparity between them. Obviously, large states are going to be capable of actions that ordinary people aren't going to be engaged in. But that's not to say that ordinary people can't have an impact. And this is, I think this is very much a pressing question today, where we're one day shy of the 1 month anniversary of this storming of the Capitol by so-called ordinary people that essentially carried out a terrifying activity that ultimately shook the foundations of the world's most powerful state. So I think this is very much a pressing question for us today. So let me turn to Cody Foster's paper. And it's my sense that Foster gives us a somewhat ambiguous answer to this question of whether or not non-state players really do have an impact on the world stage. He focuses on an individual, that of course being Bertrand Russell, and his efforts to build and promote the International War Crimes Tribunal in response to the American war in Vietnam. And Russell's tribunal drew a great deal of attention to the horrors of the Vietnam War and the growing movement to end the conflict. But controversies remain over how much influence this anti-war movement had on the larger course of the conflict in Vietnam. The New Left and its supporters often claim that the movement was instrumental in ending the war. Right, this is one of the favorite arguments of some of these people that were involved with the movement, the sort of general constellation of anti-war groups, this idea that they ended up prevailing and they ended this unjust imperial war in Southeast Asia. Now, I would note here that one of the great ironies of this story is the fact that many right-wing scholars make the exact same argument. Right, that the movement was involved in ending the war, but they do so as a way of offering a sort of stab in the back thesis. This notion that the US military was winning in Vietnam, but those damned hippies ruined everything. So it's, in the case of Vietnam, you have this really interesting dynamic where both the left and the right will tell you that the anti-war movement played an important role. In the center, however, it gets a little bit stickier, a little bit more complicated. Lian Hang Wen argues that the anti-war movement in the United States, along with people's diplomacy as conducted by the Vietnamese communists, also played a key role in ending the war. And certainly revolutionary states and groups throughout the so-called Third World devoted significant resources to conducting this type of people's diplomacy on the world stage. Right, the register of the goings on at the UN General Assembly is full of these sorts of activities from the 1960s moving onward. The UN becomes a major forum for this type of political organization. Of course, not everyone is convinced that these groups actually played a major role in the world stage. However, scholars such as Andrew Bacevich, who is no champion of US foreign policy, has called such arguments about the impact of the anti-war movement, quote, hogwash. On the other hand, Jeremy Suri, who is in some ways more sympathetic to the conduct of US foreign relations and the activities of American foreign policy officials, in his book, Power and Protest, he reframes some of these debates by arguing that leaders in the United States, the Soviet Union, Europe, and China staged détente as a response to the fury of domestic protest movements and the danger of greater unrest during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Yet another group of scholars have come to focus on the late 1960s and early 1970s as a key moment in the growth of a global human rights movement. For many of these scholars, Russell's tribunal represents an important early attempt to forge a human rights consciousness amidst the carnage of the Vietnam War. But did human rights matter in the end? No less a scholar than Mark Bradley ultimately concludes that human rights mattered for some people at some times. Still not exactly a really, concrete statement as to just how important human rights were. More recently, Petra Gerda has argued that starting in the 1950s, an array of peace movements set out to create alternative institutions for world peace aimed at challenging the nation state's control of the international system. In doing so, she argues, they helped to lay the groundwork for the end of the Cold War. And this argument dovetails with some of the ideas that Sarah Snyder put out in her work on human rights and the end of the Cold War. So I would press Foster on this question, right? Did the efforts of Bertrand Russell's tribunal actually help to end the conflict? Can we draw a direct line between the tribunal's activities and the end of the Vietnam War? Or were the effects only visible in the longer term, right? Perhaps the tribunal was not directly implicated in ending the war, but it did help reshape things in a longer view. More broadly, how did the growing human rights consciousness influence global affairs in the late Cold War? Certainly by the time that we get deeper into the 1970s and 1980s, you do see governments, even like the government of the United States, for instance, engaging in human rights rhetoric, at least selectively, to serve its own purposes, which is not the same thing as saying that this human rights movement truly reshaped the dimensions of global power. Conversely, should we think of the tribunal as a precursor to later human rights groups, or something more like Facebook or Twitter? And this is something that occurred to me during Foster's presentation, where he was particularly interested in the ways that the tribunal was able to put out information in a way that moved around the restrictions of the mainstream media. And of course, this is an issue that we're very much grappling with today. This idea that you no longer need to be ABC or CNN to have a megaphone that reaches millions, if not billions, of people around the world. So returning to the big question of whether or not these non-state groups exercised power on the international stage, John Perry gives us a very firm answer, and that answer is, of course, yes. He takes a regional approach in looking at refugees, religious organizations, and stateless peoples who fell outside the structures of the secular post-colonial nation state. And Perry, with his paper, shows how these groups complicated the US government's efforts to prop up a regional order in the Middle East at the beginning of the Cold War. For Perry, these sub-state groups held a large degree of what we might think of as negative agency, right? They might not be strong enough or powerful enough to seize control of the state themselves, but they could act as spoilers in the Cold War, which gives them a certain degree of power and a certain degree of initiative in this story. Moving forward, Perry might think about the deeper implications of why these groups lacked access to formal state power. For groups such as the Palestinians and the Kurds, the answer can of course be found in the historical events surrounding the end of the colonial order. The creation of Israel, Syria, and Iraq precluded the creation of a Kurdish state and a Palestinian state. More broadly, as Perry notes, some of this story is wrapped up in the messy transition from a world of empires to a world of nation states. And here he channels some of the thinking of scholars such as Jane Burbank and Fred Cooper, who have argued that empires worked by deploying a politics of difference. They accepted ethnic and religious diversity and exercised differential sovereignty for different groups within their borders. In contrast, nation states usually sought to foster a degree of homogeneity. Indeed, the concept of the nation state was tied to this notion that national and often ethnic identity was connected to state power, or rather that it should be. As such, minority groups who had lived for generations under imperial systems suddenly found themselves locked out of power and influence in new post-colonial nation states. On the other hand, the Muslim Brotherhood represents a more complicated issue, and in some ways, I think, kind of a more intriguing player, or at least intriguing in its own right. And that's because the Muslim Brotherhood was not really a minority group, right? They represented a majority religion in Egypt and throughout much of the region. And what made the Brotherhood different was the fact that they clashed with the Western-backed project of secular modernity. This idea goes back to the conceptualization of the post-colonial nation state as a secular enterprise. For leaders in the 1940s and 1950s in the United States, in Britain, and also in places such as Egypt and Syria, modern nation states were by definition secular, and this just made sense. It was largely taken for granted by most of these leaders. Even through the 1960s and into the 1970s, this notion that a modern nation state was a secular enterprise. Groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, however, offered an alternate vision of Islamic modernity that clashed with this notion. Ultimately, the shortcomings of this concept as the nation state, as something or as the modern nation state, as something that has to be secular, came into full view with the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which of course took a theocratic turn that placed the Ayatollah Khomeini and his supporters in power. Later groups such as Hezbollah and Hamas rose up as challengers to this framework. And after the Cold War ended, as we all know, groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS sought to unite an even broader Islamic community in opposition to an American-led global order that was still very much rooted in secular conceptions of national power. So I would ask Perry, why was it that the nation state seemed to contain, or that the Middle East seemed to contain so many of these stateless groups? Is this primarily a story about the legacy of European colonialism? Is this a Cold War story? And to what degree is the United States ultimately responsible? How does the United States fit into this narrative? You've offered, some general ideas, but I would kind of press you on this issue. Secondly, how do groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood challenge us to rethink the possibilities of what the post-colonial state could have been? Right, there was a moment, and you're sort of talking about this era, when there was a certain degree of contingency. There were other possibilities for what could have happened in the Middle East and in other parts of the post-colonial world, right? What other options were possible? Was the post-Cold War failure of the post-colonial nation-state projects in places such as Egypt and Syria inevitable? Ultimately, both of these papers by Cody Foster and John Perry, presented today, invite us to grapple with the question of how ordinary people on the streets of Cairo, London, Washington, or Lexington can have an impact on world affairs. And for that, I think we are all in your debt.
Thank you so much, Paul, for those very thoughtful and wide-ranging remarks, illuminating. I think what we'll do next is let each of our speakers have a chance to respond to what you've said, just briefly, so that we can then open up the floor for more questions. So Cody, would you want to go first there?
Yes. Good. Am I unmuted? Thank you.
Yeah.
First of all, thanks to John as well. It's good to see another friend who came in, we came in together and everything. So it's nice to see somebody else presenting their work who is, as far along as I am, and probably feeling the pain and pressure of all of it as well. But it's good to see you. And Paul, yeah, thank you for such good notes. I think what you're asking here is really important. Do non-state groups matter? And it's a question that I've been dealing with since I started this project. I was giving a talk at a Texas Tech, one of the Vietnam conferences, and Justin Hart came up at the end and he said, "I think the point that we're trying to make here is that it's not always necessarily about the human rights factor. It's not necessarily about the anti-war movement. Sometimes it's just people wanting the United States to be better." And I think that there's something to be said about that, it's not maybe an overhaul of values, because that can't be done, an overhaul of idealistic views, because that can't be done. But sometimes a group that just says, we expected more from this power and we want more. And so here's kind of our demands. So as I'm looking at this question of do non-state groups matter, it's something that I contend with in the dissertation. This is what I'm presenting from today is largely from chapter 1. By the time we get to chapter 6, I make a more broader argument about the overall impact. And I do so through case studies isn't a great way to put it, but individual sections within the chapter that says, okay, here's the impact that it had on people's tribunals over time. I mean, the last people's tribunal, I think, was in 2007 in Iraq, and they're still called Russell's tribunals. So there's an impact factor there for people's tribunals. There's an impact on the dialogue, the language, the conversation that people are having during the war itself. The last image I put up just says, try Johnson for genocide. Well, that's not just one poster. There are multiple examples where student unions, movements, teach-ins, et cetera, are writing to Russell saying, I need more information so that we can incorporate it into our group. So we can see how it impacts the anti-war movement in that way. We can see how it impacts the human rights movement in that way. So I think by the time we get to chapter 6, at least I'm going to try to answer the question that you asked, and the question that I think is really important is, how does the tribunal matter? Not just do non-state groups matter, but how does the tribunal matter to the Vietnam War? And one of the ways that you address it is as, did this help to end the war, as some of the scholarship has tried to contend with? No, I don't think it was able to end the war. So then we try to get into a discussion of then what did it actually do? So I think by the time we get to the end of the dissertation, I'll hopefully have some better answers for you to that degree. Yeah, I think that's. The last point that you made, the Twitter and Facebook thing, that's really good. I think as historians, we're always hesitant to incorporate more contemporary examples like that. But I might try it and see if George will let me, come back with me. No, don't use Twitter, I'm sure. But I think, it's a really good point, because even though Russell tried to create an unbiased tribunal, he tried to use an objective lens. He wanted to use evidence, all the things he had been working on from the 1950s forward. Well, he kind of stepped aside, and it was really taken over by Jean-Paul Sartre, Schoenman, and Dellinger, and all of these other people who were on the committee. They took the spirit of Russell, but then they turned the tribunal into something else, which is how we got to the genocide part. So we got pushed much further left. So was it that the tribunal really just was a mouthpiece? Was it really objective in the end? I think they tried to do their best, but they had their own biases. You can take the evidence that they presented and actually take it back to things that really did happen: attacks on villages, the use of fragmentation bombs, the use of napalm, things that really did happen. But how much was that evidence actually incorporated into the anti-war movement? And then how did they use that? How did the anti-war movement use that against Johnson, or to help provoke a peace movement? That Twitter, Facebook part is really interesting to me. So I'll have to think about discussing that a little bit more. But I think that's all I've got for now. Thank you for the comments.
Thank you so much, Cody. John, do you want to take a turn?
Sure. Well, first off, Dr. Chamberlain, thank you for your comments. With regards to the first question that you posed, why hasn't the Muslim Brotherhood seized power? I think that's a really good question. And I hadn't really thought about it until now. But I think ultimately it comes down to the role of the military in Egypt. I know there's a whole set of literature out there devoted just to looking at the military in Egypt. I think ultimately they have just as strong of an influence in Egyptian politics and Egyptian society as the Muslim Brotherhood does. Perhaps it's although there's undoubtedly members of the Muslim Brotherhood in the army, there's undoubtedly religious individuals in the army. I think the army might represent that sort of secular other half to Egyptian society that develops in this transition from empire to nation state. I think it's one of these sort of threads of possibilities that pops up along with the Muslim Brotherhood in this transition. It leads me back to sort of Cooper and Burbank, who look at this transition, and sort of they argue that there was really an array of possibilities that existed when we're looking at decolonization. We often tend to look at this transition as inevitable, as the nation state was destined to become the next phase in politics. But I think they argue, and I would agree, that it wasn't just this one option, stay with empire or go to nation state. I think there was lots of different possibilities that existed. And I think these religious thread, that's the Muslim Brotherhood, the sort of military thread that develops in Egypt, I think they're part of that transition. That would obviously need more research to look at how and why the army came to play such a strong role in Egyptian politics, but I think they're ultimately, the same, or they're each one side to the same coin, or however that phrase goes. I'm obviously getting the phrase wrong, but I think you've all heard it before. You know what I'm trying to say. as far as looking at what role the U.S. ultimately played in the history of a lot of this instability, I think they played a strong role. But I think it's also important to remember that colonialism was there and sort of sowed the seeds that the U.S. inherited. And I think, again, I'm led back to sort of Cooper and Burbank, who asked or posed a question, or really sort of states, not the question of whether or not the United States is an empire is not necessarily what's important. What's important is looking at the similar modes of power that are used by the United States, the British Empire, or the Mongol Empire, the Roman Empire, looking at how these different modes of power have been used and what conclusions can we draw from this. So so what I'm trying to say is that the United States has played a significant role, but it's not simply the United States. They're not the end-all, be-all origin of the problems of the Middle East. I think there's lots of things going on there, lots of things that played a role, including colonial empires and the empires that came before them. So I think the United States did play a significant role, and I think the Cold War, you could argue, is sort of a new wave of sort of imperialism. I know that these terms would probably get me in trouble, but I think it's sort of an extension of what was there before. And so, long story short, I think it played a role, but they were not the sort of end all be all for the region's instability.
All right. Thank you so much, John. So we actually have a bunch of people with hands up. So maybe we'll go ahead and collect the first 3 questions and then let you have a round of answers. And so the first person with his hand up is Jeremy Popkin.
Hi, am I unmuted?
You're unmuted.
Okay. Actually, I have a couple of questions and comments for both speakers. First of all, I have been chatting with Cody Foster to correct him on one point. My father had no connection with Bertrand Russell. He knew my father was a professor of philosophy. He knew Russell's work, but I have no trace of any personal communication between the two of them. He certainly was not involved with the tribunal. I think the big question your paper raises, or one of the big questions, is how do we measure the influence of a protest movement like the protests against the Vietnam War? Looking at the screen, I suspect I'm the only person, maybe Jim Albacete was around. Did you march against the war, Jim? So maybe the two of us were very small participants in the movement. And obviously the protest movement did not bring the war to the end. Johnson and Nixon continued it for years after I gave up marching, certainly. But, there's such a thing as a climate of opinion that limits the choices of decision makers. Lyndon Johnson chose not to run for re-election after the showing of Eugene McCarthy and his anti-war campaign in the Democratic primary in New Hampshire in early 1968. Nixon and Kissinger, too, had to take into account how much uproar their decisions were creating in the United States. Nixon, goes over to the draft lottery system to try to disarm some of the campus protests, people who were in danger of losing their draft deferments. And I did have a question for you to think about. What's specific about the Russell Tribunal is its attempt to turn the Nuremberg precedent against the U.S. government to kind of create a judicial forum to condemn the American conduct of the war, which was a very different strategy from that of the student movement on American campuses, for example, or many of the other protests in the world. So you might want to think about that. To John, I wanted to raise a question about what you said about the Palestinian issue. First of all, there are not millions of Palestinian refugees at the end of the 1948 war. There are fewer than a million, and at the time, nobody thought they were going to be remaining in camps generation after generation, as it has turned out. And it's worth bearing in mind that hundreds of thousands of Jews have to leave the Muslim countries after the creation of Israel and wind up there. So from the Israeli point of view, it was somewhat like the population exchange at the end of the Greek-Turkish War in the 20s. But the larger question, I think, is what role the United States had in 1948 at all. The United States did recognize the state of Israel, as did the Soviet Union and most other countries in the world after it was created. But if you look at the steps leading up to it, I don't think you can say the American government had much control over it at all. After the British announced they were leaving, the last thing the United States government wanted to do was become responsible for what was going on there. After voting in favor of the partition plan in November of 1947, the American government suggests in March of 1948 that maybe it wasn't a good idea, maybe the British should stay on, which was a way of saying we don't want to be responsible, but we'd be happy if somebody else would take charge of it. In any event, I think it is kind of a red herring in your argument. The Palestinian refugees are absolutely powerless after 1948. They can't, the Arab states won't do anything for them. None of the outside powers will intervene on their behalf. I don't see how you can argue that they have much influence on world affairs until the 1960s, and the period that Paul Chamberlain has studied in his first book. I would suggest that the statements you're making about that aspect of your work are kind of distracting from the argument you want to make. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we have three other folks who have questions, and want to try to make sure we get everybody's questions in here. Emily, you're next.
Okay, I have a question for Cody, and I'll try to be brief, and it's about information. And so this may just be sort of a side aspect of your interest in this. And so if you'd want to skip over it later on, that's totally fine. But, people of this era, the mid 20th century, have a tendency to be pretty idealistic about how information has potential, right, to modernize or democratize or even just be disseminated. And it has to do with the different mediums that are coming out. And so I wanted to encourage you to be critical of Russell's perspectives on information, even if he wasn't really able to be critical of that. So what mediums might the evidence be disseminated by, right? Are they reliant on TV? Are they reliant on publishing books or newspapers? What perspectives would the members of the tribunal have in the aftermath of the tribunal if most media sees this as slanted, right? So are they starting to lose that sense of idealism about how media or information is conveyed and its lack of mobilizing potential? But then I was really broadly interested in about this kind of international aspect, right? So they're thinking about the crimes of the United States, but also of other countries that are supplying soldiers or supplying material, right? So is there kind of an anticipation of an international audience for these things, and how is that going to be conveyed, and what type of change do they kind of think can be created? And I just wanted to mention that there's a recent article in Critical Inquiry, the journal Critical Inquiry, called Communicationism, Cold War Humanism. I can send it to you, but it has a pretty clear takedown of this type of idealistic language about information that was really pervasive in this era, but is really problematic if we think back on a kind of global framework.
Thank you so much. Next is Jillian.
Hi, thank you both for your papers. for your presentations. I wondered about what breaking down some of the binaries could do for your project. In Cody's project, I was thinking specifically of the state versus non-state, and you were talking about how experts were kind of looking to activists. And at one point you used the term bottom up and bringing some of those ideas up as a challenge. And I wondered, you know, there seem to be several levels to the non-state actors. And I wonder if you get into that and whether it's useful to suss out those nuances, because even experts, I'm wondering, okay, well, what institutions did they go to? How are they funded? Are they actually non-state actors? So that's what came up for me in that. And then for John, when you said empire accommodated difference better than a nation state. And that sounds like, you know, after hearing Dr. Chamberlain speak, that this is a larger argument that is going on in your field. But I wondered to what extent leaving out all of the death, violence, and physical abuse that goes on during empire, during that transition, kind of allows for a statement like that about accommodation and difference. Because it's not just that things are being divided and moved, but also that lives are being lost, people are being hurt. So to what extent do you get into those conversations, the fact that there's violence going on during this transition? And then if you acknowledge that, can you then say that empire is accommodating difference? Because I think that's pretty incendiary. So I'm wondering what thinking about the physical and material consequences on the ground of that could do to change that assertion. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, so we have two questions the last two questions, and then one from Jim and one from Brandon, and then we'll let our speakers speak. So Jim, you're up next.
Not really a question, it's sort of a response to what Paul said about Twitter and the dissemination of information. The War Crimes Tribunal in 1967 made it into the attention of a high school senior, which I can testify back then. And I'd also, in 1966, really liked Barry Sadler's Ballad of the Green Berets. It was an important step from there to Country Joe and the Fish, and Feel Like I'm Fixing to Die. And that was at least a small portion of that. The information did get out.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. And so, Brandon.
So my question is a little bit related to what Jillian asked, but I was wondering if the two of you could just discuss how you're defining the state and who you consider state actors and who's a non-state actor and why. Because I feel like the border between those two categories has a lot of meaning.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so there are a lot of great questions, and so there is a lot on John and Cody's plates here. So we'll go ahead and let Cody start first. Cody, strictly speaking, you have 4.5 minutes. But you know, I suppose if you go to 5, we'll.
Oh dear.
So
okay.
5 minutes to try to wrap that all up.
Okay, I'll see what I can do here. I guess I can start most recent and work my way backwards. I think I have the most response to Jeremy here at the end. I didn't catch the name of the last speaker who asked the question about non-state.
Oh, that's Brandon. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Brandon.
Yeah, hey, my name's Brandon. I'm a postdoc this year. Nobody's physically met me because
bummer.
I was down. But.
Yeah. Okay. Well, nice to meet you. Nice to have you. Without getting into the lengths of the definitions for non-state, which can vary from person to person. You've got some people who look at non-state in terms of like non-governmental organizations. You've got people who are looking non-state the way that I'm doing it, which is very broadly like anyone who isn't in a position, a government position, anyone who isn't working for the UN, anyone who isn't with the Johnson administration, and maybe even anyone who isn't necessarily fighting in the military in Vietnam, but that can get a little into a gray territory as well. So for me, when I'm talking about the non-state, I'm looking specifically kind of at a civilian, like a civilian role. Not a great definition, but one that'll have to suffice in 5 minutes. But you and I can talk, later if you'd like. For Jillian, this kind of answers a bit of your question here too, the state versus non-state binaries. Yeah, I get a little into discussing the binaries too. We're looking at anti-war activists, we're looking at anti-imperialists, we're looking at workers' organizations. I'm looking at housewives. When these people received, people you wouldn't expect to receive information about the War Crimes Tribunal, when they did receive the information, they could turn it and use it however they wanted. They could inform their own domestic anti-war movements around them. They can inform their communities. But even in places as far as the most, rural areas in, say, Bolivia, regular housewives were encountering information about the war crimes. They were saying, wow, this really speaks to what's happening to us here locally. How can I give this to, say, my husband, and they can use it to organize against our own state, against our own government, against American influence. But even more locally, how can they use it to organize, a broader labor movement too? So they turned the information and used it in very varying degrees. And I'll come back to that here in a minute when I answer some of Jeremy's questions. To Jim, thank you for that. It's good to know that some people received the information about the tribunal. My father-in-law is the same way. He remembers it. So it's neat to hear how some people remember it, how others remember it. What I'd like to do is find more information about how American soldiers heard about it while fighting in Vietnam. I don't have any information on that, and I'd like to, but that'll take some work. To Emily, yeah, I'd love to see the article. If you can send it to me, that would be really helpful, because I think examining the role of information itself is really important, of how they use the information, how they receive the information, and how they want to kind of democratize the information. Is there an anticipation of an international audience? Absolutely. They expect that because New Zealand, Australia, South Korea are helping to aid in the war efforts, they're wanting to get information into the hands of people who are opposing their own, their own respective government. So it's not just supporting the U.S. anti-war movement, it's about supporting a resistance movement more broadly in different countries. So they are anticipating an international audience in that respect. But again, they didn't anticipate an audience in South America, where they're using the information not just to fight Vietnam, but to fight American imperialism or to fight authoritarianism. They're seeing the models and they're saying, we can take this information to model our own resistance movement against our own authoritarian state. But that's good. I'd like to see that article. The points you're making are really good. The mediums, the idealism, et cetera. And then lastly here, back to Jeremy, and really kind of to jump back to Paul's comments too, is, how are we measuring this impact? Well, if we think long-term about how we're measuring the impact of the anti-war movement, then that's one thing. But really what I'm looking at here is how we're measuring how the tribunal impacted the anti-war movement, not necessarily the outcome of the war in the end, but kind of that middle ground between the tribunal and the movement itself. And so I'm measuring the impact of that, measuring the impact of the influence, or what kind of influence the tribunal had. One of the ways that we can do that is to look at the risk of the user and how they're spreading information. People who are in Argentina, people who were in Cuba, Bolivia keeps popping on my mind because I'm thinking of an incident in particular, but having information about the tribunal was really threatening. If you had information about the tribunal, or you wrote to the tribunal or something, I mean, your mail was being read, and you could be, the state could come after you and throw you in jail, or perhaps even kill you. So transferring the information was of great risk. So the risk of the user kind of implies a significance to a certain degree of the tribunal's power. And also POWs and those who were trying to dodge the draft, right? Those who are willing to use the tribunal's information to avoid the draft, to argue that this is in violation not just of my conscience, but of international law, and I could be tried like those at Nuremberg were tried, so I'm not going to fight. They were taking a great risk too, and they expressed that in their writings. Not just that that they were afraid of being thrown in jail, but they were afraid of what their families and communities were going to think of them. So they were taking a great risk too. The last few points here, I know I'm probably over 5 minutes now, but last point here is that
5 minutes now.
we want to also look at the way that the non-state is interacting with the state. So we see that the Johnson administration is actually struggling in its foreign relations with, say, Sweden or even Great Britain or even France, all of the places where the tribunal wants to hold its sessions. The US is getting involved, and Johnson goes to a funeral, for example, and he refuses to speak to the prime minister because the prime minister of Sweden says, we're going to allow the tribunal to happen here. So in ways, it is impacting US foreign relations in much deeper ways than just those few. I've got some other thoughts. I can send my thoughts by email here since we're, yeah. Thank you all, though. I do appreciate all the feedback. It's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry we're short on time, but we're going to give John his chance to respond. And thank you for your patience. We'll have to go a few minutes over, I think. All right, go ahead, John.
All right. First off, thank you, everybody, for your comments and questions. I think I should probably start with Dr. Popkin's questions. So with regards to the idea that there weren't millions of refugees, at least with regards to the sources that I'm looking at, there's around 1 million right off the bat. Now, you may have different sources that disagree with this, but from the sources that I'm looking at, it's very clear that hundreds of thousands are pouring into neighboring countries. Now, if you have different sources, I would love to check them out, because we could exchange notes. But with regards to the idea that they were helpless and really didn't play a role with regards to the politics of the region or on the global stage, I would argue that they're playing a very real significant role just by existing, just by being refugee camps in Egypt. That's playing a role on the local politics in that area, which then is affecting the national politics. These camps for US policymakers are going to become, in their minds, bastions of communism. In their minds, these camps become the most dangerous areas for the creation of Soviet agents, for the development of communism. And they're going to play a very, very strong role in the minds of how US policymakers envision the security situation in the region. I would agree with you that they're not able to physically alter certain aspects of the politics, but my argument is that their just very existence is shaping the way people think about the politics of the region. Also, with regards to the idea that the United States didn't play a very strong role in the partition of Palestine, or at least the UN vote, I again will be interested in seeing sort of the source work that points to that, because even if you look at how the British just sort of dropped that in the laps of the UN, that in and of itself, at least for me, forces the United States to do something. Otherwise, the Soviet Union would have exploited the US, saying, look, they're not doing anything about Palestine. So for me, I see the US really playing an instrumental role in the UN decision. With regards to, I think it was Jillian's comments of looking at how Empire really still had a lot of violence, a lot of coercion. And I think I stated that in the presentation by me saying that it really sort of accommodated difference better. I'm in no way saying that Empire was somehow more positive for people. I'm not saying that Empire or the nation state is more positive or more negative. I'm simply saying that the nature of Empire necessitated this system of politics of difference, where there's going to be violence involved. So we're going to conquer this group of people. We're going to slaughter half of them, but then they have to figure out a way to incorporate them into their system. So I'm not saying that violence didn't exist. I'm not saying that horrible things didn't exist under Empire. I'm simply saying there's dimensions to those systems that accommodate a difference better, perhaps, than the nation state. One book I would encourage you to check out that Dr. Chamberlain recommended to me is this book, Empires in World History: Power and Politics of Difference. And really, the whole argument of this book is looking at how empire sort of accommodates difference across time and space. So again, I don't want you to walk away thinking that I'm somehow saying that empire didn't have these very didn't have violence, didn't have coercion, because I mean, obviously, it very, very strongly did. I think that's one of the points. Probably out of time anyway.
Thank you. I mean, you have another minute or two if there was something else you wanted to say, but if you're, yeah.
Did I miss anybody else's? I think I'm probably good. We're over time.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank our two presenters, Cody Foster and John Perry, and our discussant, Paul Chamberlain. I would also like to thank all of the folks in the audience for your wonderful questions. And it seems like there's a lot to talk about, and I can see us continuing over a virtual beer in some future time. So thanks again. It's great to see you, Paul, and we're very happy to be able to have this workshop. Our next workshop is next Friday. It's at noon rather than at 2. So I'll send out a notice, but it's at 2 o'clock. It's at noon on Friday the 12th. All right. Take care, everybody.